We're live.
Okay. All righty. Let me start.
Sure, please.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling the Legislative Policy Committee to order. The purpose being to process a budget amendment, transferring the total of $250 million from the Revenue Stabilization Account, better known as Rainy Day Account. Senate President Ferguson and I received a letter from Secretary Brinkley, which brought us here today. Mr. President, anything else?
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and appreciate the context that you've provided on this. For sort of a general overview, this was the first time that the administration had moved forward to use the rainy day funds, power that was provided by the legislature by the time when we left on March 18th. That outlined sort of the oversight of the use of additional rainy day funds. We wanted to make sure that the executive had the flexibility that was necessary to respond to the crisis. And with it came a level of transparency about how those funds would be used. So this was the first time that the administration moved forward with exercising those rights that were provided through the General Assembly. And that is the background context for why we're here today. So we look forward to hearing from both the Department of Legislative Services and Secretary Brinkley. And I believe we are beginning with the
Legislative Services.
Legislative Services is providing us an overview of the amendment.
Right. Yes, if they can begin, David Roman, if you want to.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Right ahead.
Okay. Yes, the DLS presentation is going to be myself and Emily Haskell. Emily's going to kind of walk you through the details of what the proposed $250 million of spending is for, and I'll talk a little bit at the end about the fiscal implications and a couple of recommendations that we have. So I will turn it over to Emily to walk you through the kind of the details of the program.
Thank you. Could you go to the next slide, please? I'm going to start by spending a little while on this slide, which gives an overview of the business relief programs that have been implemented so far, and also where the new proposed funding is going. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, the administration has provided $241 million to these programs so far, and a little over $200 million of that has been dispersed as of this month. This is almost entirely federal funding, mostly from the CARES Act. And then you can also see the proposed $250 million from the Rainy Day Fund. So this newly announced funding will approximately double the state's business assistance that's been provided so far. Now working down from the top, the first program is Commerce's COVID-19 Emergency Grant Program, which provides grants up to $10,000 for businesses and nonprofits with fewer than 50 employees. This program has received $103 million so far, including $8 million that was reserved for nonprofits. And the department has given out $99 million of this so far. The amount reserved for nonprofits exceeded the demand among the existing applicants, so around $2 million of this will be returned to DHCD for their nonprofit initiative, which I'll discuss in a minute. Commerce estimates that the additional $50 million from the Rainy Day Fund that will be provided for the grant program will allow them to fund all of the applications received for the program. So no new application round will open for this funding, meaning that all $150 million for this program will be awarded to businesses that applied by the first week of April. Next, the emergency loan program included $75 million for loans of up to $50,000 to businesses also with fewer than 50 employees. The department's given out around $72 million of this so far, and no new funding is being added for this program. Next, the Maryland Small Business Development Financing Authority, or MSBDFA, used its $5 million in funding to make 65 loans of up to $200,000 to economically or socially disadvantaged businesses. And new funding of $5 million will double the investment so far in the program. Next, the Emergency Relief Manufacturing Fund provided $3.7 million out of the $5 million available to incentivize the production of PPE and other critical needs items. Then the Emergency Arts Grants Program provided $4 million across 2 rounds of funding to independent artists as well as arts organizations. And now the administration is providing an additional $3 million for arts organizations. Then the administration also plans to provide $2 million for a new program, the Hometown Tourism Development Program, which will be used to promote visiting local shops, restaurants, and attractions. Those are all of the programs in the Department of Commerce. The Maryland Department of Labor manages the Layoff Aversion Program, which earlier in the year used $10 million in federal funds, both from the CARES Act and Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act grants, to provide grants to 445 companies to help avoid layoffs. The administration is providing an additional $20 million for the program, and applications for that are reopening today. It's worth noting that these funds can't be used to pay for rent or for wages, except as part of the department's unemployment insurance work sharing program if businesses are participating in that. Next, DHCD is administering the $39 million nonprofit recovery initiative to provide grants to nonprofits working toward the economic recovery or in health and human services or in housing underserved populations. $10 million of this is reserved for providers licensed by the Behavioral Health Administration or Developmental Disabilities Administration. Less than half of the overall funding was obligated as of the end of September, and less than a quarter was out the door to nonprofits. The administration has also added $20 million for assistance to entertainment venues and other businesses impacted by the pandemic in Maryland Main Street and Baltimore City Main Street communities. And now I've bolded the last two items as they represent a large portion of the newly planned funding, which is going to new programs, which we don't have a lot of detail on at the moment. The first is $50 million for restaurant relief, which will be distributed through local jurisdictions with a deadline of the end of this calendar year for expending the funds. The funding can be used for a wide variety of expenses from rent to cleaning services to expanding outdoor dining capabilities for the winter. And then the last line is $100 million for an emergency rapid response fund, which the administration wants to be able to deploy flexibly as needed, with no details further than that provided now as to where and how this funding will be allocated. So I know that was a lot of information quickly. I'd be happy to answer questions on the program basics now before I go into some observations and considerations, or I can wait until the end for questions, whichever you prefer.
We do have one question from Chairman of Budget and Taxation Committee, Senator Gazzoni.
Thank you, Mr. President. Could you go over again that first topic? I want to be clear that $8 million reserved for nonprofits, was that part of the prior funding? And does the next section have a requirement for nonprofit?
That was part of the second round of funds that were awarded to the grant program in June. So it was $50 million initially, then $45 million for additional grants to businesses, and $8 million that was reserved for nonprofits that had applied. And using that $8 million, it was only around $5.6 million, I believe, was required to fund all of the nonprofits that applied to that program. So the new funding will finish funding the businesses that applied, but there is still funding available for nonprofits in the Nonprofit Recovery Initiative under DHCD. That funding is still being processed now.
Okay. And the second question is, of all, other than the one that's specified as the new money ending by December 31st, 2020, what's the date on all the rest of it?
I don't have a date on all the rest of it. I'm sorry. You might want to ask the Secretary of DBM for that one.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
So we have another Senate question, Chair of our Education, Health, Environmental Affairs, Senator Pinsky.
Thank you, Mr. President. Quick question. I've read about some of the money being used to upgrade technology to do online ordering. Does that fall under the restaurant relief portion?
So the restaurant relief funding is new, but I believe several of the programs could have been used for that purpose. For example, layoff aversion fund or the main commerce grant and loan programs, I believe, could be used for that purpose.
So there are multiple categories that money could be used for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Thank you.
Pascal, are you handing it over to Mr. Romans? Or are you going into the next section?
I have a few more slides.
All right, you can proceed.
Next slide, please. I want to put these business assistance programs in perspective. The largest programs, that's the COVID-19 emergency grant and loan programs, provided relief to around 10,500 recipients, including 549 nonprofits, which amounts to nearly 8% of the small businesses and 2% of nonprofits in the state. Compared to the Federal Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, the state programs are rather small. For comparison, the PPP provided forgivable loans to 87,000 Maryland businesses, totaling over $10 billion. These businesses had up to 500 employees compared to only 50 employees for recipients of the state assistance. But even for loans that were of comparable size to the state loan program, that's $50,000 or less, 56,000 businesses in Maryland received PPP loans of this size for $1 billion total. One issue to note with the state programs is the potential for duplication, both with other state programs as well as with federal or local programs. Around 1,000 businesses received both a grant and a loan from the emergency grant and loan programs. And there was also some duplication with recipients of the grants to arts organizations. Also, companies applying to the Miss Bidful loan program could also receive a grant. And it's unknown how many recipients of these programs also receive federal or local support. Next slide, please. Two of the newly announced programs focus on restaurant relief, that was $50 million, and on entertainment venues. Those are emphasized in the $20 million Main Street program. And while payroll data do indicate these have been some of the hardest hit industries, there's once again the potential for duplication with other programs. For example, will businesses be eligible for these programs if they've already received relief? The chart shows data on the percent of emergency grants and loans that were already provided to businesses in these industries, which you can see exceeds the overall percentage of Maryland businesses in these industries, which makes sense given how hard these businesses have been impacted during the pandemic. But again, there's the potential for duplication with these new programs. Next slide, please. I want to bring up some additional considerations regarding the implementation of these programs. First, the administration has provided $241 million since March for all of these programs. And while the pace of getting this funding out the door has certainly sped up, around $39 million has still not been dispersed. Some of the logistical difficulties have been understandable, especially given that the Department of Commerce's total budget prior to all this new funding was $153 million for fiscal 2021, with $70 million for grants. And now they're giving out over $180 million in grants and loans for these new programs. But given these challenges and the amount of time it's taken to provide the first $241 million, with $39 million still left, it's worth asking what's being done to make sure this next round of $150 to $250 million reaches businesses in a timely manner. There's also a lack of detail for many of the new programs. For example, most of the existing programs were first come, first served. Will this be the case for the new programs as well? What are some of the more specific program parameters? Are those going to be decided by Commerce and DHCD? And for the restaurant program, how much flexibility will local jurisdictions have to define how these programs are going to work? How is the administration incorporating lessons learned from the earlier programs? The least detail is available for the $100 million Rapid Response Fund. I think more detail is needed on how the administration envisions determining how, when, and where to use this funding. And for the programs that have already received funding, we don't have a lot of data on the outcomes. We can see how much money is going out to how many businesses, but we don't have measures of the results. How many businesses have been able to remain open after receiving funding? How many jobs have they been able to retain as a result? It would be prudent before doubling the funds invested in these programs to try to understand how they've been working. Lastly, is there intent to backfill this funding with federal funds if they become available? Originally, the emergency grant and loan programs and layoff aversion program were funded with rainy day funds before the CARES Act funding became available. And is there an intent to do that again if possible? And with that, I'll turn it over to David to talk about the overall impact on the rainy day fund and the budget outlook.
Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the implications for the rainy day fund. So at the end of session, you all passed legislation that authorized the governor to use up to 150 million from the rainy day fund. As you can see, the governor is going above and beyond that at the 250 million level. He's also, by taking 250 million out of the rainy day fund, bringing the balance in the rainy day fund below 5% of general fund revenues, which very rarely happens and almost never happens intentionally. There's actually statute that says that that can't be done without an act of the General Assembly. The governor is using his interpretation of his emergency authority to both take that larger amount, the 250, and bring the rainy day fund below 5%. In terms of rainy day fund going forward, though, there's a mandate that for fiscal 22, the upcoming budget year, that the governor appropriate money into the rainy day fund since we had a large surplus at the end of fiscal 20. So we will very quickly go back above that 5% threshold in the next fiscal year. Now let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so the other issue is sort of the opportunity cost, if you will, of using this money for the recovery initiative. So this graphic shows you the DLS estimate of the budget outlook for fiscal years 22 to 26 on a cash basis. The blue bar part shows you our estimate of spending combined with the Board of Revenue Estimate's official September revenue estimate. And the gap would be 605 million if there was no economic recovery initiative and the 250 could be used to balance the budget. Since there is the recovery initiative, the gap will grow to about 855 million. And then the BRE actually offered an alternative revenue estimate that is substantially worse and would add an additional 1.6 billion to the gap there in fiscal 22. So the point here is just that you're looking at probably an 850 million to over $2 billion budget challenge in the coming year. And this 250 million could have been a piece of that solution, if not for being used for this initiative. Next slide. This is our final slide. A few kind of recommendations. Our first suggestion is that the administration consider delaying the 100 million transfer to the Emergency Rapid Response Fund. As Emily discussed, we haven't spent all of the money that is already available. And we have 150 million of fairly specific programmatic ideas from the administration. This 100 million, there's really no detail on. We don't know, what the criteria would be. Would it go to a couple of businesses? Would it be spread across all of the businesses? So the thought is that the administration should come back when they're ready to spend the money and they know what they're going to do with it, and then propose taking the 100 million out rather than essentially asking for a blank check at this point in the process. The second issue, as Emily alluded to, is that the reporting on the money that already is being used for economic recovery activities has been sporadic and maybe not as helpful in terms of understanding what its impact has been. So we suggest that the administration try to provide you with more robust and regular reporting going forward. And finally, just a thought that there should probably be some consideration to whether the first come, first serve allocation of funding is the best way to go, or if we should be trying to target the money to the businesses that are having the most difficult time in the current climate. That concludes the DLS presentation. Happy to answer any other questions you have.
Are there any questions for members? Please demonstrate as such by using the hand raise function. If so, we'll give it just a moment. Questions for DLS? It appears there are no further questions. Thank you both for that very detailed and helpful and succinct presentation. It was a good overview of a very broad program. So from this point, we will move to hear directly from the department. Secretary Brinkley, if you would like to take it away.
Good afternoon. I presume my microphone is working okay. Did I hit the proper button? Okay, good. Good afternoon, President Ferguson, President Emeritus Miller, and Speaker Jones, and the other members of the Legislative Policy Committee. For the record, my name is David Brinkley, Secretary of the Department of Budget and Management. And I'm here today to discuss the governor's proposal to transfer $250 million from the Revenue Stabilization Account to various agencies and state government to address COVID-19 related impacts to businesses. While I'm in my office talking to you on 45 Calvert Street. I also have in the office with me Deputy Secretary Mark Nicole and the Executive Director of the Office of Budget Analysis, John Martin, should we need their resources too. So while Maryland is experiencing better economic recovery than the nation and most other states, there are, however, increasing indications that the national economic recovery is stalling. The failure of Washington to provide additional stimulus relief is having a devastating impact on small businesses and struggling families in our state. To date, Maryland has provided almost $250 million in economic support from the Coronavirus Relief Fund established through the Federal CARES Act. This funding has helped Maryland's small businesses stay open and their employees to keep their jobs. Governor Hogan believes, and I presume most, if not all of you would agree, that the state has to do more. So last Thursday, the governor announced the Maryland Strong Economic Recovery Initiative. This new $250 million investment will fund a combination of new relief programs, as well as the expansion of some of our existing successful relief programs in order to quickly provide additional relief to small businesses and their employees who need our help the most. Let me briefly discuss these eight segments and then attempt to answer any questions that you may have. And if I or we don't have an answer, we're happy to follow up with you. The first part was the $50 million expansion of the Maryland Small Business COVID-19 Relief Grant Fund. It provides direct, immediate grants to businesses and nonprofits that have lost revenue because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This $50 million represents the third installment of this successful program, which we launched in March and expanded in June, bringing our total investment to $145 million for the Small Business COVID-19 Relief Grant Fund. And I think this is very important. It will allow the state to fully fund the entire backlog of all of the small business grant loan applications. These applications have obviously been received, but more importantly, reviewed and vetted by Maryland's Department of Commerce. The second part is $50 million of direct relief to restaurants. And maybe some of this will address Senator Pinsky's question before. It will direct grant relief to qualifying restaurants across the state. Funding will be allocated through local jurisdictions and must be distributed no later than December 31st. Eligible uses of funds include working capital, such as rent and equipment and services, to expand outdoor dining, including tents, heaters, warmers, and carts, or funding for infrastructure and health improvements, including HVAC filtration systems and sanitization services. Technology upgrades to support the expansion of carryout and delivery. I know that was his question. And the purchase of PPE for restaurant staff. Going off script here a little bit, just to say, the issue is a lot of these operations were able to do on-street dining throughout the summer and maybe into the fall. But we're faced with the challenges that Florida doesn't have to deal with. And our mission is to try to provide some resources to help them get through to spring in whatever they might be. Those that don't have an outdoor activity, maybe there's some upgrades for some of the HVAC and filtration systems so that they can ensure safety of their patrons and certainly their workers. And again, I remind you that unless the public feels safe going to some of these venues, they're not going to show up. And so that's some of the challenges that we're trying to address in light of the winter coming about. The third portion of this, $20 million for the expansion of the Maryland COVID-19 Layoff Aversion Fund. It supports employers undergoing stress by preventing or minimizing the duration of unemployment caused by layoffs. Funds can be used for any of the following: promoting telework. We've had great success here at the state in having people do telework. Assisting with employee education and training. Purchasing services and supplies to maintain an on-site workforce, and supporting the Maryland Department of Labor's work sharing program. To date, this program has saved nearly 9,000 jobs. The fourth element is $20 million designated for direct relief for entertainment venues and our Main Street programs. The Department of Housing and Community Development indicates this will be broken into $15 million to assist entertainment venues such as Maryland's theaters, live music venues, and other spaces for the performing arts, which are vital to both our cultural and our economic development. The other $5 million is targeted to small business assistance through designated Main Street organizations. Main Street organizations will apply to DHCD to set up their own small business relief grant program. Recipients must be located within a designated Main Street Maryland community. There are 33 of these organizations in 23 counties and 8 in Baltimore City. And then I was notified today, we had a conversation with DHCD, and I was notified that the Notice of Funding Availability, which is also referred to as the NOFA, for these programs goes online at DHCD's website today. The fifth element, $5 million, is explicitly designated to Maryland Small Business Development Financing Authority, some know it as MSBDFA, for the expansion of small and minority business low interest loans. This effectively doubles support to $10 million for these loans administered through MSBDFA. This funding supports working capital, supplies and materials, machinery and equipment acquisition, land acquisition, or real estate improvements. And I point out that, remember, this whole pandemic environment has placed other stressors on these type of businesses that maybe they ordinarily wouldn't have had to deal with, whether they are plexiglass partitions, upgraded HVAC systems, or whatever they might be. We're trying to lend additional assistance there. The sixth element is $3 million for the expansion of arts organization funding. This increases funding to $7 million for the Arts Council Emergency Grant Program. It supports arts organizations and artists for losses sustained because of programming, operations, or events that have been canceled due to this pandemic. The seventh element is $2 million for the creation of a hometown tourism program. I heard the analysts say this is a new program. Part of the goal here that Commerce had was there are tourism programs locally. Let's try to give them a little boost so that they can try to get people to come out to support their own restaurants and all. Again, we're trying to fund local destination marketing organizations to support hometown tourism efforts that promote the local restaurants, attractions, and shops. And finally, the eighth element to this is $100 million to create an emergency rapid response fund for our small businesses. Our goal here is to be able to immediately deploy resources to regions, employers, and workers in the greatest need as the pandemic continues to affect sectors of the state's economy in disproportionate ways. I want to emphasize that. What's happening in Western Maryland is different than what's happening in Shore, which is vastly different from what's happening in Baltimore City or Montgomery or Prince George's County. And then you have varying combinations throughout that. And our mission here is to try to be as dexterous as possible. As we have all seen since March, we need to be flexible about how we respond to the pandemic. And some of our organizational structures haven't enabled that. We feel we've worked through the majority of those, but I will admit certainly not all of those. And as with the virus itself, we don't know who, what, where, when, or how these needs will present themselves. Hence the idea to enable this to be flexible going into the winter season. Again, our goal is to enable the state to be flexible in its response to save Marylanders their jobs. We believe that these additional actions by the governor will provide economic assistance to our employment base and allow the state to continue on the still uncharted path to recovery. I would note that after the governor's action, the rainy day fund still has a balance of $938 million, which is equal to 5% of the general fund revenues. The possible discrepancy between ours and DLS's stand is that the FY21 budget also called for a $54 million transfer out of the rainy day fund into the general fund, and that hasn't happened. So using a portion of the rainy day fund is both fiscally responsible and entirely in keeping with the purpose and spirit of why we have a rainy day fund in the first place. So with that, Mr. President, Madam Speaker, members of the committee, I'll be happy to attempt to answer any questions members of the committee may have. And I think, as I said earlier, if we don't have an answer, we'll be more than happy to follow up. And
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate your presentation. It appears we have the first question from our Chair of Finance Committee, Senator Kelly. Oh, Senator Kelly, give us just a moment to unmute. All right.
Thank you for the information. Got a couple of questions. One, many of the theaters and art organizations that you're trying to help are probably by now in a worse situation in terms of distancing, because we're going indoors to do things that previously, had we given them this money earlier, they might have been able to do out of doors. So I'd like you to tell us what your thoughts are regarding that. With the distancing requirements that for health reasons, we must have them honor, how is it going to work that you're giving them this money now that it's winter coming and we've got a new wave of the pandemic? The other question is what to have you say whether or not the governor or you are looking at the needs of all counties so that everybody would get something that's meaningful, as opposed to some getting a lot and others getting nothing. And I had a third idea, but if you could answer those two things, I would appreciate it.
well, let me touch on the performing venues, because may have been able to perform outdoors. I know it was very creative when some concerts did things by drive-in theater, which I thought was very creative. I don't know that any of those were produced locally. We received a written request from the performing venues. Now their requests combine production and the facilities, the theaters. Some were for-profit, some were non-profit. And so we're trying to blend some of the needs that we saw for that. For example, the Hippodrome, the Maryland Theater, and some of those other operations, have not been able to have anybody come within. They can't move things out to the street. Maybe they did some street performances. I know the BSO had occasionally, but they couldn't do that at all. And yet they still have fixed costs in trying to run their HVAC systems. They had some personnel issues. Some of them might have been eligible and received some of the nonprofit monies, but certainly everyone's been negatively impacted in a long realm like that. So this has been an attempt, this $15 million, to try to address some of that. The request that came in was for $25 million, and for us to take that from some of the COVID funds. But we've already got a lot of the COVID monies allocated. And what we're trying to do now, and I'm shifting gears a little bit to another explanation that maybe others have this question, but we're now trying to follow up not just on state agencies, but also the local governments that we gave some monies to, that the governor had the discretion to give to 19 jurisdictions. So they're the 19 smaller ones, to find out where they are in that spending process and how much, if anything, that they have left, or where are they going to spend it. Why? Because we want to try to get it back so we can recycle it. My mission, my goal, is for us not to leave $1 on the table by the deadline, which is December 30th. And I will
Could I butt in and ask you this then? What metrics or instructions did you give these counties and also the small arts organizations when you gave them the money? Are you just going to wait to see what they're doing with it, or did they have to come with a plan that also the health requirements?
DHCD has been handling the requirements or the for the nonprofit community. So I'd have to defer to them as to what they use and categorize them. I know, for instance, it had to validate that they were still valid nonprofits, and we did the same thing with the for-profits in the business community, that they had to have some of that tax detail. Let me see what this, and the Arts Council, yeah, correct. The Arts Council itself is handling their distributions.
And with regard to the restaurants that you're planning to help now, are you sure that they are all still operating, or are you basing this on what the circumstances were months ago when they first applied?
That's one reason why we're transitioning this more to the locals in that context, is rather than reinvent the wheel. That was one of those bureaucratic inefficiencies that got in the way early on. And Congress discovered some fraudulent attempts and some things along those lines. They have some of their vetting on some of those that are waiting in line. On the restaurant side, rather than the state reinvent the wheel, we know that the locals control, for instance, their liquor licensing and some of the health inspections. They know who they are. They know if they're still there. This is why we're trying to map it out so that they have a say in where this goes. Some of them are in municipalities. Some of them aren't in a municipality. Some counties don't have a municipality to follow through in that regard. So, and the other aspect to that, you notice that there's a slight discrepancy by 1 day. We want that money out by December 31st. The federal restriction is December 30th. The December 31st is attached to the state's money, and we are not under the federal guidelines on that. We're not hampered by that. We'd like to use that as our guardrails in trying to make sure that it gets out. But the other concern on this is, especially if it's for heaters or tents or some other type of facility, even to do drive up or delivery, is if we get into December, it's too late for some of those to continue on. The weather will have already, and so the mission here is to try to get it to the forefront, and Commerce is working very diligently with the local jurisdictions. I think, Senator, that goes to your one point is, can we make sure this is responsive to each of the 24 jurisdictions? So that was one of the missions there. You had a bunch of different questions. I hope I touched on all of them and tried to address all of them.
Well, you helped some, thanks.
Looks like we also have we do have a delegate question from the delegate. Madam Speaker, do you?
Delegate Corman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Secretary Brinkley, for being here. I wanted to ask, DLS briefly touched on the need to repay the rainy day fund because we're going to be below the 5%. So I wanted to hear what your thinking was on how that would proceed, and then maybe even a roadmap to getting up to the 6% and beyond, if you've given any thought to that yet.
Well, we have thoughts on that and certainly concerns in trying to get to that as we make the budget submission. We maintain that we haven't violated the 5% in the first place. If we do go down through that, because remember the $52 million that was also authorized from the rainy day fund into the general fund has not been moved at this point in time. So that's why we know that we're within those guidelines absent that $52 million. So that doesn't create the necessity to reinflate it back up to the 5%. So we're comfortable with where we are on that.
Okay, I don't want to argue with you about whether or not you're below the 5%. Let's just say hypothetically that you go below the 5% because it's continuing to rain. Have you given any thought to how quickly would you need any statutory changes to slow down the repayment, anything like that going forward?
Well, I mean, at this point, my recommendation would be that we just simply go ahead and reinstate it to the 5%, because keep in mind, in December, we'll also know what the new threshold is that we all have to meet. And that threshold will either be higher or lower than what the BRE had recommended in September. We just don't know what those numbers are going to be at this point in time. But from my communication saying this to you, my recommendation is if that number should fall below the 5%, then we need to program in, getting it back to the 5% of whatever that new number is.
Thank you. If I could ask a follow-up, Madam Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I'll say relatively early in this crisis, DLS had to piece together what was being spent. And at one point, I either heard you or Mr. Nicole said they were close, but it wasn't totally accurate. Do we have your commitment to provide more accurate figures on sort of a going forward basis so that we're not relying on DLS to piece together press releases to figure out what money's going out the door, but that there's a better line of communication?
Yeah, and they're receiving all the budget amendments now. So they're not just getting a roundabout number. They're getting, what the amendment comes through and what it's for at this point in time. And, in all frankness, we're also now trying to go back to some agencies and try to dot their I's and cross their T's and try to hold their feet to the fire. I think, I know that we heard that yesterday in the presentation to spending affordability, that DVM and DLS are trying to work on MDH to try to certify or ratify some of those details.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Madam
I have
Speaker.
to acknowledge that from my perspective, we've been working very closely with DLS and trying to gain some intelligence and moving things forward. But also up till now, our issue has been to make sure that some of the agencies have the resources that they need to do what they got to do. We've heard a lot of horror stories about what's going on in some of the correctional facilities throughout the country. From my perspective at this point in time, DPSCS has done more than an excellent job. Not to say it's been 100%, but they've done more than an excellent job in trying to care for not just the people that they have confined, but their workers, and trying to maintain some of those details. Our mission had just been to make sure they got the resources to do that.
Next
Thank
question,
you again, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Zucker.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Madam Speaker. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary. So just to confirm what the analyst said. So is by your calculation $40 million that still has yet to be allocated by the state from the previous round?
On the federal money,
Right.
federal money, I guess we're in that ballpark, which is, but I'll point out, and maybe I'm looking at my team, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I still have $400 million of requests for some of that money too, which is the reason why we're now trying to shake the trees to say to the counties, if you haven't allocated all of it, we need it back because we have a need. We're trying to deal with that on the health side too. The Department of Education, we're trying to, like I say, just to shake some of that down because we have unmet needs when it comes to unemployment insurance, when it comes to some other health related things, because we don't know what the food is going to be like. I know that MDH is preparing for some things to carry them into the spring. And to the extent that we can try to shore our reserves up for some of that, again, our mission, and when I say our mission, I don't just mean the executive side, I know yours too, is to ensure the safety of the public so that we can weather this storm. And we see that, we've not been doing a very good job through other parts of the country, nor in other parts of the world.
Mr. President, if I could just have a follow-up, if that's right. So obviously the General Assembly is very invested in economic recovery and making sure that people, working families, have the resources they need. And that's why we wanted to give the governor flexibility when it came to spending the rainy day fund. But in terms of, and then I'm kind of piggybacking off of what Delegate Corman mentioned in terms of kind of piecing together press releases. And you said that you would work with DLS to get information out, but obviously this is taxpayer money. We want to protect taxpayers. So what efforts are you going to make moving forward to make sure there's transparency, that taxpayer money is not only transparent on how it's being spent, but also giving us an idea of sort of where it's going? Are you all going to have any kind of interactive maps where we can see if something in Prince George's County has been funded or something in Montgomery County has been funded, so we can really see where all the money is going to?
It's an interesting question. I don't know that we'll specifically have any maps or any detail down to that level. I could, but right now what we're trying to do is be responsive to what Commerce says they have a need for. We're trying to be responsive in ensuring that DHCD has some of the resources. Why this kind of came in the back door, the request from the performing venues and some of those producers, and then we determined that DHCD already had been doing some of that work. Therefore, they already had some of the infrastructure, software, whatever you want to call it, or people cognizant with what was going on with that they would be the better ones to be able to administer that. And so that's been our issue now, is trying not to just reinvent the wheel, which is what we had to do early on. Senator, I don't know if that answers your question, but what we do want to do is, number one, we want to know the information for ourselves. Then we want to make sure that we get it to your teams, because I get that there's a responsibility that you all need to know as to what's going on, and we want to be able to share all that. But when we go through the process of getting some of the amendments, which then you have another review on it, it then becomes broken down into even much more detail.
You know, Mr. Secretary, it wasn't about me necessarily knowing what's going on. It was about Marylanders knowing where the money's going to and knowing what's going on. But thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I don't disagree with you on that. As I try to remind people, and when I was in the legislature, I coined the term, it's OPM. I've heard it used a lot, but it's other people's money that we're all responsible for. We have a fiduciary duty in that regard.
Next question is from President Pro Tem Melanie Griffith. Senator Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good to see you, Madam Speaker. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your presentation. My question is along the lines of my colleagues that have preceded me, but I would like to take it in just a little bit of a different direction. I've had this conversation with you in the past, and also Secretary Schultz, very interested in finding out if you all have been able to drill down and get a sense of, in terms of the grant monies that have been awarded thus far and the plans to distribute additional money. I think Senator Kelly talked about the geographic distribution of funds. I'm also interested in learning whether or not you have a sense of minority business participation. And I know the Secretary Schultz has mentioned that a lot of the grant and loan funding was applied for in that first wave, and that you all were not going to be able to take additional applicants. So my question is, as you got that first wave, if those businesses were the best equipped and best positioned to respond to the open call, were not the businesses that had the greatest need or weren't reflective of the businesses that would benefit the most from the funds, do you have a way of capturing that data? And I think DLS mentioned that we're not necessarily able to, based on the turnaround time, look at the actual outcome from the funding that's been distributed. So I'd just like to hear a little bit about that data collection and minority participation in the funds. And I did hear the MISBIDFA additional $5 million, but there are so many other minority businesses that might have benefited from grant funds that just won't be in the lineup because of the way the funds are distributed.
Right. That's a great question, Senator. And I don't have the answer to that, but you know that Commerce should have some of that. And I will follow up with her. And if you have some specificity on what you'd like to do, if you send that to me in an email, I'll just forward it to the secretary to make sure we can get some of that back. And I know that some of your other members would also like to see that detail. And honestly, I'd like to see it myself.
Sure, and just to give you a little sense, if I could, Mr. President, it is a lot of folks just didn't get in line that wanted to apply, and the application process was closed very early. And so if there is no new line, then they missed the first round and will, by that fact, miss the second round. So that's a little bit of specificity for you, just not being able to even come to the table to make the ask. So.
Understood. And thank you for that.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you, Senator. It appears our final question is from Senator Pinsky.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your work, and on a personal note on your support. So thank you. I think we all understand that we want to help small businesses and nonprofits. We all have them in our district. We want to make sure they're successful, and the families that own them and work in them can survive during these difficult times. I think we also know that there are many different sectors that are in great need: working families, small businesses, and then in different aspects of the sectors, education, farmers. There are a lot of people in need. So I want to go back to something Dave Roman said when his last slide talked about some questions. One was, we give authority for 150 million, but with the executive authority, the governor has gone for 250 million. One thought was to hold off on that other $100 million until we meet in January to decide what the economy looks like, if there'll be a stimulus from the new president, and what are their needs in other sectors, like education, for example. And let me just, as an example, use education. You know, the governor has offered $10 million for reopening. And besides protecting our small businesses, we want to reopen and have students in-person instruction back in our schools. But we've heard from all jurisdictions that they are digging very deep, not just for Chromebooks, but to clear their HVAC systems so it's healthy to return, to test teachers and other staff members, and they're having great difficulty. But yet in this effort, this $250 million, there's nothing there for education. There's nothing there for farmers and other areas. So, you know, I want to pull back to 30,000 feet, not ask for, you know, some money going to this small business or that small business. I heard from one of our colleagues who said that maybe some of the COVID need should simply come from the Kerwin proposal, essentially making the Kerwin report a rainy day fund. And I think that's very dangerous. You served on the commission for 3 years and know the importance of that work going forward. It wasn't just to put our finger in the dike, but actually to propel Maryland forward. So it's really a broader question of who picks, I hate to call them winners and losers, but what sector should receive this money, and whether there have been any consideration of just stopping at 150 million, not going to 250 million, and allow the legislature in concert with the governor to make some of these further decisions come January.
It's a great question and a fair question, Senator, and also thank you for your comments early on. But again, my thoughts and prayers are with you and your family. I guess the key that we are looking at here is, and maybe some of you won't like what you hear in this context, but our thought is time is money. And right now, as we're heading into the winter, the issue is being able to take some action and have an impact that will last. And in this instance, just using the restaurants as an example, is helping them get through these months where they might not be able to do street dining. Let's get them there. One of the greatest benefits we can provide for the people of our state is that, you know, the place where they went to work is there to continue to take them back to work. That's what they want to do. They want to be able to work and take care of their families and prosper and grow. They don't want necessarily some assistance in that regard. And so our sense is this needs to move forward. There is still 900 and how much left in the rainy day fund? $938 million that, Senator, it doesn't mean that conversation doesn't take place when it comes to January regarding the balance of the rainy day fund. And once we see what some of the new numbers are, we're right. We might have to tap into that even further and spread some of that there. And then when it comes to the education side, and I hear what you're saying, and that's a fair comment to make. We're following up with them on some of the federal monies that had been given to them through the governor's discretion to say, where does that stand so that it doesn't have to be a return. I'm advised by the superintendent that you know we distributed this, or it's in the hands of the locals. We'll do some follow-up. And they also had some other direct assistance provided to them. The organizations, the nonprofits, the employers that were trying to benefit by this action, it is time sensitive with winter coming upon us. And they're going to have to start, you know, either curve back or shut down some of their ability to deliver any type of service and provide any type of work. So having said all that, what you say is very important, very meaningful, and I don't pass on that, but we can have some of those conversations about the other $900 and some million when you guys come in January.
Mr. President, just a quick follow-up, very brief, if I could. I think returning students to in-person instruction is also fairly time sensitive. And while there is over $900 million in the fund, as has been said before, we have to stay above 5%. So thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
believe that concludes questions. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. We appreciate your comments and appreciate your presence.
Thank you, and everybody stay safe and take care of your families. If I don't talk to you before Thanksgiving, have a great Thanksgiving, however that might look for all of us, because I truly am thankful for, they don't have a textbook for how we deal with all this stuff, but I'm certainly thankful for the opportunity to be here to try to deal with it. So stay safe.
Thank you, everyone. Our respective budget committees will be monitoring this. Thank you.
Thank you all. We will follow up and look forward to soon. Stay safe and appreciate the comments and presentation.
Thank you.